I didn't notice when being near him stopped feeling optional. At first, it was logistical. The archive building was old, acoustically inconsistent, the kind of place where sound lingered in corridors long after the people who made it were gone. Julian had been brought in to assess how silence behaved there. I worked 3 floors up, cataloguing cognitive imprints, recorded interviews, memory logs, fragments of recollection people donated when they didn't know what else to do with them. We were adjacent by design, not intention. Our first conversations were brief and procedural. He asked how long the room stayed occupied. I told him when the building felt most crowded despite being empty. He listened in a way that suggested he was storing my words somewhere precise, not emotionally, but structurally, like reference points on a blueprint. I didn't think of it as closeness then. We didn't touch. We barely faced each other when we spoke. Most of our exchanges happened side by side, staring at opposite walls, listening to the building settle. It began with chairs. There was a bench outside the sub-archive room, positioned oddly between 2 pillars. Julian started sitting there in the afternoons, notebook open, pen unmoving. One day, without looking up, he said, "If you're going to stand there, you might as well sit." I sat. Not next to him, across the narrow gap of the bench, our shoulders aligned but not meeting. He exhaled after, slow and deliberate, as if something had finally aligned. That should have been my first signal. Instead, I told myself it was coincidence, that my presence meant nothing beyond convenience, that people didn't orient their breathing around other people unless they were aware of it. We didn't speak much after that. Sometimes hours passed in shared silence. I would read through memory transcripts while he sketched sound diagrams that looked like waveforms trapped in rooms. When I stood to leave, he never asked me to stay. He simply paused his pen, waiting. If I hesitated, even briefly, he resumed drawing. If I left, he didn't look up. But the next day, he would arrive earlier. I started adjusting my schedule without realizing it. Julian never asked personal questions. He didn't need to. He seemed to infer enough from the way I annotated files, from the order I stacked documents, from the pauses I took before speaking. When I did talk, he listened with an attentiveness that felt precise rather than warm. It was unsettling and calming at the same time. Once I asked him why he preferred that bench. He said, "The acoustics stabilize when you're here." I laughed, assuming metaphor. He didn't smile. "You're quieter than most people," he added. "Not in volume, in arrangement." That was the first time I felt something like intimacy, being described not physically, not emotionally, but structurally, as if my mind had a geometry he could rest against. After that, he began timing his work around mine. If I stayed late, he stayed later. If I left early, he packed up within minutes. Still, no invitations, no requests, just alignment. People noticed before I did. Mara mentioned it casually one morning. "Your shadow's already here," she said, nodding toward the stairwell. Julian stood below, back turned, listening to the building like it might answer him. "He's not my shadow," I replied too quickly. "Didn't say he was," she said. "Just said he follows your hours." I told myself it was professional overlap, that we were both studying systems, memory, sound, that required consistency, that proximity didn't imply attachment. But there were moments when I would step away for coffee and return to find him unsettled, pen tapping too fast, posture slightly misaligned, moments when my return caused him to straighten without acknowledging me, moments when silence felt heavier if I wasn't there to absorb part of it. He never crossed physical boundaries, never leaned in, never brushed my arm. In some ways, that made it easier to ignore what was happening. There was nothing obvious to resist. One evening, the building lost power. Emergency lights flickered on, casting everything in diluted amber. I stood to leave, assuming we were done for the day. Julian didn't move. "Stay," he said. It wasn't a request. It wasn't a command. It was a calibration. I can't work if the spatial balance shifts abruptly. I sat back down. The lights hummed. He resumed writing. We stayed like that for nearly an hour, the building breathing around us, until the power returned. When it did, he closed his notebook immediately. "Thank you," he said, as if I had held something in place for him. Walking home that night, I felt useful in a way that was quieter than pride and deeper than obligation. I told myself that being needed didn't have to mean being trapped. That proximity without touch was harmless. That comfort could exist without cost. I didn't yet understand that he wasn't allowing me to stay close because he liked me there. He was allowing it because the space inside him collapsed when I wasn't.
From which city in the world are you watching this story today? If stories like this, about the unseen, the classified, and the impossible, fascinate you, subscribe. There are more truths hidden between the clouds than we'll ever be clear to see.
It took time before I understood that what Julian needed from me wasn't conversation or validation or even companionship. It was continuity. Once I noticed it, I couldn't unsee it. My presence didn't inspire him. It stabilized him, like a constant frequency that prevented interference. When I sat nearby, his thoughts arranged themselves cleanly. When I was gone, they scattered. I began to see the pattern in small, unremarkable ways. If I arrived later than usual, his handwriting changed. The neat compression of his notes loosened, margins drifting wider, diagrams less symmetrical. He didn't mention my lateness. He never did. But the building felt different when I entered, as though something had been waiting to lock into place. I started leaving my bag on the floor beside the bench, a quiet signal. When it was there, he relaxed. When it wasn't, his foot tapped, almost imperceptibly, against the stone. I told myself this was nothing, that people have working preferences, that routines anchor us all. But then he began to speak differently when I was present. Not more, just clearer. Julian rarely verbalized uncertainty, but when he did, it was always while I was sitting nearby, eyes on my own work, not on him. "This room absorbs sound too aggressively," he murmured once. "It feels compressed." I nodded, instinctively. "It holds on too tightly," I said, "like it's afraid of losing what passes through." He went still. "Yes," he said, after a moment. Then, softer. From then on, he started narrating his thoughts aloud. Not to me exactly, but around me, as if my presence made articulation possible. I didn't interrupt. I didn't offer solutions unless he asked. And slowly he began asking, not questions about the building, questions about how memory behaved under pressure, about whether recollection distorted more in isolation or in crowds, about whether silence was absence or accumulation. I answered carefully, aware that my words seemed to matter more than they should. What unsettled me wasn't the intensity, it was the ease. There was no escalation, no flirtation, no physical closeness beyond the bench, the shared air, the aligned hours, that made it feel safe, non-threatening, almost virtuous. We were two professionals sharing intellectual intimacy. That's how I framed it. But intimacy has weight, even when it's invisible. Julian began to rely on me in subtler ways. He wouldn't start a new assessment until I arrived. If I was deep in my own work, he waited. If I stood to leave, he finished whatever he was doing with unnatural speed, as if the idea of continuing without me nearby wasn't viable. Once, I tested it. I didn't sit. I stood by the window, pretending to organize files, deliberately keeping distance. Within minutes, his posture shifted. He leaned forward, then back. His pen hovered uselessly above the page. "You don't have to sit," he said eventually. "I know. But if you're here," he added carefully, "it helps when you're within range. Range. Not closeness, not company." I sat. The relief was immediate, though he didn't acknowledge it. He resumed working, breathing evenly again. And something in me softened at the reaction, at the proof that I mattered in a way that didn't demand performance or affection. Being needed without being touched felt clean. Mara noticed the shift before I did. "You're quieter lately," she said over coffee, "like you're conserving something." "I'm just busy with him," she said, not unkindly. I didn't respond, because saying no felt dishonest, and saying yes felt dangerous. The truth was, I had started prioritizing his equilibrium over my own rhythms. I timed my breaks to coincide with his sessions. I postponed meetings. I skipped lunches. Not because he asked, but because I knew he worked better when I was there. That knowledge was intoxicating. There's a particular comfort in being essential without being exposed. He didn't want my body. He didn't want my emotions. He wanted my steadiness, my cognitive presence, the way my silence didn't intrude. It made me feel irreplaceable. And yet, there were moments when the air felt too thick. When I sat beside him, I sometimes felt as though I was holding something fragile in place, like pressure against a fracture. The idea of standing, of leaving abruptly, carried a strange guilt, as though I would cause damage by simply reclaiming my autonomy. One evening, I packed up early. Julian noticed immediately. "You're leaving," he said, not accusatory, observational. "Yes," he nodded once. "All right." I took 3 steps before I heard the pen drop. It was a small sound, barely audible, but it stopped me. "I'll finish tomorrow," he added. "It's not aligning today." I almost stayed. The impulse was automatic, physical, but I forced myself to keep walking. That night I slept poorly, not from desire, but from unease, as if I had abandoned something mid-process. The next morning he was already there when I arrived. His notes were immaculate, precise, complete. "You finished?" I said. "Yes," he replied. "Eventually." There was a pause. "But it took longer," he admitted. "Without you." The honesty landed heavier than any confession could have. Not because it was emotional, but because it was functional. I smiled, unsure how else to respond. Inside, something tightened. Comfort, I realized, could become a structure. And structures, once built, are difficult to leave without collapse. By the time I realized there were rules, I had already been following them. Julian didn't believe in unnecessary articulation. But the rules existed all the same, embedded in the spaces we occupied and the ways he allowed me to move through them. There were chairs I could take, and chairs I couldn't. The bench outside the sub-archive was mine. So was the narrow stool near the acoustic testing room, the one with the uneven leg that forced stillness. But when I once pulled a chair from his workspace without asking, he paused, mid-sentence. His silence stretched long enough for me to return it without comment. He nodded then, almost imperceptibly, and continued. I told myself it was about order, about his sensitivity to spatial disruption. But the feeling lingered that I had crossed an invisible line. Julian began to invite closeness in specific, controlled ways. He'd gesture for me to stand nearer when he needed to explain something, but only for as long as the explanation lasted. When he was done, he stepped back first, restoring the original distance. I learned the rhythm quickly. Proximity was permitted when it served a function, not when it sought connection. That distinction mattered more than I wanted to admit. There were moments when I caught myself wanting something unstructured. An unplanned pause, a shared glance, a moment of warmth that didn't resolve into productivity. Each time, the space between us remained intact, perfectly calibrated. And yet, the intimacy deepened. Julian began sharing fragments of his internal life, not emotionally, but cognitively. He spoke about how certain frequencies made him restless, how crowded spaces fractured his attention, how silence, when improperly shaped, could feel hostile. You don't intrude, he said once, as if explaining a design choice. Your presence doesn't demand recalibration. I understood then that I wasn't just stabilizing his work. I was stabilizing him. That knowledge should have made me cautious. Instead, it made me careful. I became precise with my movements. I sat where I was supposed to sit. I spoke when invited. I stayed quiet when his focus narrowed. I was proud of how seamlessly I fit into his system. It felt like love, if love were defined as being exactly what someone needed. Still, there were cracks. One afternoon I arrived to find him already working with someone else, a junior consultant, unfamiliar, loud in the way people are when they don't realize how much space they take up. She stood too close, gestured too broadly. Julian's posture was rigid, his answers clipped. He saw me through the glass and visibly relaxed. I'll finish this later, he told her abruptly. She blinked, surprised, and left. You didn't have to do that, I said. Yes, he replied. I did. We sat in silence afterward. The bench felt narrower than usual. It struck me then, he wasn't just allowing my closeness. He was excluding others to preserve it. That should have alarmed me. Instead, a quiet warmth settled in my chest, unwelcome and undeniable. I didn't want to be special, but I wanted to be chosen. Julian never framed it that way. He didn't speak of preference or attachment. He spoke of alignment, compatibility, optimization, but the result was the same. I was the variable he protected. He began to anticipate me. If I reached for my pen, he shifted his notebook. If I leaned back, he adjusted his chair, not to mirror me, but to accommodate me, as if my presence required constant, subtle recalibration on his part. Sometimes our hands came close, not touching, never touching, but near enough that I could feel the heat of him, the restrained energy. The absence of contact made the awareness sharper, more deliberate. I wondered, briefly, if this was desire, but desire implies wanting something more. Julian seemed content with exactly this. One evening, as we prepared to leave, I lingered by the door, watching him pack up. On impulse, I stepped closer than usual. Too close. He froze, not recoiling, but still like an overloaded circuit. Ira, he said quietly. I stepped back immediately. Sorry. He nodded once, the moment passing. But something had shifted. After that, the rules tightened. He was still kind, still attentive, but the allowed distances became more defined. The spaces where I could exist narrowed slightly, precisely. It felt less like rejection and more like boundary reinforcement. And I complied, because the alternative, disrupting the equilibrium we had built, felt unthinkable. There were nights I replayed our interactions, searching for evidence of something mutual, something warm. All I found was function. And yet, function can be intimate. He trusted me with his vulnerabilities, even if he didn't name them as such. He allowed me closer than anyone else. He structured his world around my presence. That had to mean something. Still, a question began to surface, faint but persistent. Was I close because he wanted me? Or because he needed me to remain exactly where I was? By then, my days had begun to curve around his, not dramatically, not in ways that looked like sacrifice, just small adjustments, sliding meetings, delaying errands, choosing corridors that passed his workspace instead of others. Each decision felt insignificant on its own. Together they formed a pattern I didn't question because it didn't feel imposed. Julian never asked me to stay longer. He didn't need to. If I glanced at the clock, he noticed. If my attention drifted, his focus fractured. The dependency revealed itself not through demand, but through consequence. When I altered my behavior, his internal balance shifted. And because I could see the effect so clearly, I learned not to cause it. That was the quiet trap. He began structuring his workdays with a precision that assumed my presence. Sessions scheduled during my usual hours. Breaks aligned with mine. Silence calibrated to the length of time I typically stayed seated before shifting. Once, I arrived late without warning. Nothing urgent, just traffic. When I reached the bench, he was standing, notebook closed, staring at the wall like he was listening for something that hadn't arrived. "You could have started," I said. "I tried," he replied. There was no accusation in his voice, just fact. Something in me tightened anyway. Julian's reliance grew more intricate. He no longer needed me only to begin. He needed me to maintain continuity. If I stepped away mid-session, his progress stalled. If I spoke unexpectedly, he paused to recalibrate. I had become a stabilizing constant in a system that no longer functioned properly without me. The intimacy of it was undeniable, even without touch. He trusted me with the unguarded versions of his mind, the places where structure failed, where sound overwhelmed, where his thoughts spiraled without anchor. But intimacy without reciprocity becomes weight. I started feeling it in my body first. A pressure between my shoulders when I sat too long, a tension in my jaw when I stayed silent to preserve his focus, a fatigue that wasn't physical but cognitive, as though I was holding a shape in place for too long. Still, I stayed, because leaving felt like dismantling something delicate. Julian noticed my strain before I named it. "You're restless," he said one afternoon. "I'm fine." "You're adjusting too much," he corrected gently. "That wasn't part of the design." The design? I almost laughed. Almost asked when I had agreed to be part of one. Instead, I said, "I don't mind." "I know," he replied. And that was the problem. He knew. He allowed me closeness because it benefited him. He trusted my steadiness. He depended on my presence, But he never considered the cost because I never made it visible. Romance crept in sideways, not through gestures or confessions, but through the way he noticed me, the way he remembered my preferences, the way his voice softened, not emotionally, but precisely, when addressing me. It felt intimate to be seen so accurately, and yet I felt increasingly unseen. There were moments I wanted him to ask how I was doing, not as data, not as calibration, but as concern. He never did. My role was to be constant, not complex. The claustrophobia arrived quietly. One evening, I tried to leave at my usual time. As I stood, Julian's pen stopped moving. "I'm not finished," he said. "You can finish tomorrow." He looked up then, really looked at me. That would disrupt the sequence. Something inside me recoiled. "I need to go," I said, firmer than intended. He hesitated, just a fraction too long. Then he nodded. "Of course," but the air thickened between us. The silence that followed wasn't comfortable. It was charged, unstable. I left anyway. That night, I felt a strange mix of relief and guilt, as if I had reclaimed something essential and abandoned something fragile in the same motion. The next day, Julian was distant, not cold, controlled. He recalibrated the space, adjusting distances, tightening routines. The closeness remained, but it felt narrower, more conditional. I realized then that my autonomy had become a variable he managed, and I had let it happen because dependency, when subtle, feels like care. The romance wasn't in what we did, it was in what we preserved. But preservation can suffocate, and somewhere beneath the structure, beneath the silence and precision, I began to wonder whether love that requires constant proximity without freedom is still love, or simply a beautifully engineered enclosure. The claustrophobia didn't arrive as panic. It arrived as arithmetic. I began measuring my days in units of him, how long I could be gone before his balance faltered, how quickly I needed to return to prevent drift. It wasn't conscious at first. Just an internal recalculation that happened automatically, like adjusting posture to avoid pain. If I stayed away too long, I imagined his pen stalling, his thoughts looping, the careful internal architecture losing coherence. That image carried weight, enough to pull me back before I reached the edge of my own intentions. What unsettled me most was how reasonable it all felt. Julian never punished absence. He never complained. He adapted, imperfectly, quietly, and I absorbed the consequences on his behalf. That made the dependency harder to resist. There was no villainy to push against, only need. And need, when unspoken, becomes obligation. I started declining invitations without explanation. Lunches, evenings, weekends. Not because Julian demanded my time, but because the idea of being unavailable during his working hours felt wrong, almost negligent. I told myself I was prioritizing focus, professional integrity, consistency. But consistency had narrowed my world. I noticed it one afternoon when Mara asked if I wanted to leave early. Her tone was casual, the offer sincere. I opened my mouth to agree and stopped. Julian was mid-session. "I can't," I said finally. "I'm in the middle of something." She looked past me, toward the bench, toward the quiet figure hunched over his notebook. "You always are," she said. Not accusing, just observant. That night, I stayed later than usual, Not because I had work left, but because he did. When I stood to stretch, he paused. When I sat again, he resumed. The connection was immediate, unfiltered. I felt it then. The enclosure. Not physical, psychological. As long as I remained, everything functioned. As soon as I moved, something destabilized. I was no longer just present. I was responsible. Romance, I realized, can hide inside responsibility. It can disguise itself as purpose, as being the one person who understands, who doesn't intrude, who holds the shape of another person's world steady. Julian trusted me completely. That trust was the problem. You don't have to stay, he said once. Sensing my hesitation, I looked at him. But it helps. Yes, he replied. That's why I don't ask. The logic was flawless and suffocating. I began feeling watched, not by his eyes, but by his reliance. My movements felt louder, my silences heavier, even when he wasn't there. I carried the awareness of how my choices would affect him later. That's when I understood something fundamental. Proximity had replaced consent. Not his consent, mine. One evening, without planning to, I said, "Do you ever worry about what happens if I'm not here?" Julian didn't answer immediately. "Yes," he said eventually. "But worrying doesn't change outcomes." That wasn't what I meant. I know. He closed his notebook, finally meeting my gaze. There was no manipulation in his expression, no calculation, only certainty. "You're stable," he said. "Stability is rare." The words landed like praise, and like a sentence. I wanted him to say he wanted me. Not needed. Wanted, but wanting implies contingency, choice, the possibility of absence. Julian's world did not account for that possibility. The next week, I tested the enclosure deliberately. I left in the middle of a session without warning. Nothing dramatic. I gathered my things calmly, said I had somewhere to be. He looked up, startled, not angry, disoriented. "I'll be back tomorrow," I added, as reassurance. He nodded. Too quickly. The rest of the day felt light, almost buoyant. I moved through the city without calculating return times, without holding another person's equilibrium in mind. The relief surprised me with its intensity. That night, guilt followed close behind. I imagined him staying late, pushing through misalignment, forcing coherence where it wouldn't naturally form. I told myself it wasn't my responsibility, that adults manage their own structures. But intimacy complicates ethics. The next morning, he was already there, earlier than usual. His notes were dense, compressed, almost aggressive in their precision. "You worked late," I said. "Yes." "Was it difficult?" He paused. "Just long enough. More than usual." The enclosure tightened again. I sat automatically. As soon as I did, his shoulders lowered. His breathing evened. The room softened. I hated how immediate the effect was. I hated how much I mattered, because now I could see the truth clearly. My presence wasn't just helpful, it was necessary. And necessity, when unchosen, becomes possession, even without touch, even without intent. I stayed seated, silent, doing my work beside him. But inside, something had shifted irrevocably. Comfort had crossed into captivity. And love, whatever form this was taking, was no longer light enough to carry. Without cost, recognition didn't arrive as a revelation. It arrived as vocabulary. Once I had the words, I couldn't keep pretending the shape of what we were didn't exist. Psychological possession. Not ownership, not control. Dependence that reorganizes another person's freedom around its needs without ever announcing itself. Julian didn't cage me. He made my absence consequential. That distinction mattered because it explained why everything felt so calm on the surface while something inside me strained constantly against invisible walls. There was no conflict to point to, no cruelty to resist, only a system that worked best when I stayed exactly where I was. I began observing us the way I observed archived memories, stepping back, noting patterns, resisting emotional annotation. Julian oriented his days around predictability. Around me, his calm wasn't inherent, it was maintained. And I was the stabilizing mechanism once I saw it. The romance changed texture. What I had read as quiet intimacy, his attention, his precision, the way he seemed to hear me even when I didn't speak, revealed itself as reliance. He wasn't drawn to me in the way people are drawn to what they desire. He was drawn to what kept him intact. That didn't make him cruel. It made him human. And it made me trapped. I tested the realization carefully, the way one presses on a sore tooth to confirm pain. I spoke unexpectedly. He faltered. I shifted seats. He paused. I arrived late. He unravelled, politely, privately. The evidence was undeniable. One afternoon I didn't sit at all. I leaned against the wall instead, arms crossed, silent. Within minutes he looked up. Are you all right? Yes. You're offset. I'm standing. He frowned slightly, as if recalculating variables. It's harder to maintain continuity when you're not anchored. Anchored. I felt something inside me snap. Not violently, but cleanly. I'm not an object, I said before I could stop myself. Julian froze. I didn't mean, I know what you meant. I interrupted, softer now. That's the problem. Silence stretched between us, unfamiliar and sure. He closed his notebook slowly. You've changed, he said. No, I replied. I've noticed. He studied me then, not analytically, but carefully, as if seeing a fault line where he'd assumed bedrock. I don't restrict you, he said finally. No, I agreed. You depend on me. The distinction unsettled him. Dependency had always seemed neutral to him. Functional, efficient. But spoken aloud, it carried weight he hadn't accounted for. I never asked you to stay, he said. You didn't have to. He looked away, processing. For the first time since I'd known him, Julian seemed unsure, not of data, but of impact. That was the moment intimacy resurfaced, not as comfort, but as risk. I thought you understood, he said quietly, that this is how I connect. I nodded. I did. I just didn't realize how much of myself I was surrendering to make it work. He didn't argue. He didn't defend himself. He absorbed the information the way he absorbed sound, slowly, fully. After that conversation, nothing visibly changed. And yet, everything did. I became acutely aware of my choices, of how often I preemptively adjusted myself to preserve his equilibrium, of how deeply ingrained the habit had become. Love, I realized, isn't just what you feel, it's what you allow to be rearranged. Julian tried in his way. He asked tentatively, whether I wanted to sit closer or farther, whether silence was still acceptable, whether I needed breaks. The effort mattered, but it didn't undo the structure we had built, because now I could feel the cost of every accommodation, and once felt it couldn't be unfelt. I wanted something dangerous. I wanted to be unnecessary. One evening, I left without explanation. No reassurance. No promise of return. I didn't look back. The space I claimed felt foreign, unsteady, mine. The next day, Julian didn't come in at all. Guilt flared, sharp, reflexive. Then I let it pass, because responsibility that erases selfhood is not love, it's occupation. When he returned 2 days later, he looked different. Not worse, not better, altered. I recalibrated, he said simply. I believed him, and that frightened me more than his dependence ever had. Because if he could recalibrate without me, then my captivity had never been necessary. It had been chosen by both of us. Distance, I learned, is not the opposite of intimacy. It is its test. When Julian recalibrated without me, something delicate shifted in the space between us. The relief I expected didn't arrive cleanly. Instead, it came braided with grief, quiet, unannounced, as if I were mourning a version of us that had never been sustainable, but had felt profoundly real. We did not speak about the 2 days he was gone. That silence mattered more than any explanation could have. When he returned, the room itself seemed altered. Chairs no longer assumed my position. The bench felt neutral again, no longer designated, no longer mine by default. He had reorganized the space with care, but without accommodation. It was unsettling to realize how much of my sense of belonging had been tied to those small, physical permissions. I stood instead of sitting. Julian noticed. He always did. But this time, he said nothing. That restraint felt intentional. The first week after my recognition was the hardest. I kept waiting for something dramatic, a collapse, an accusation, a confession. None came. Instead, we moved cautiously, like two people relearning a language they had spoken too fluently for too long. He began working alone more often. I led him. I resisted the instinct to fill silences, to steady him, to make myself useful in the way I had trained myself to be. Each restraint felt like an act of defiance against my own habits. It was exhausting. Romance lingered in the absence now, in the spaces where proximity had once been automatic. When our eyes met across the room, the awareness felt sharper, less diffuse, less safe. I wondered if this was what desire felt like when stripped of dependency. Julian began asking questions differently, not about my availability, but about my state. The shift was subtle, but unmistakable. You seem elsewhere, he said, one afternoon. I am. Is that all right? The question startled me with its gentleness. Yes, I said. It is. He nodded, accepting the answer without trying to solve it. That too was new. Still, the imbalance hadn't disappeared. It had transformed. I could feel his effort in the way he withheld reliance, the way he paused before aligning his work with my presence, the way he chose discomfort over convenience. It was painful to watch. Love, I realized, isn't only expressed through closeness. Sometimes it appears as restraint. One evening as we prepared to leave, Julian spoke, without looking at me. I don't want to need you in a way that diminishes you. The words landed softly, but their impact was seismic. I don't want to be needed that way, I replied. We stood there, neither moving. The distance between us felt intentional now, chosen rather than enforced. I don't know how to want without depending, he admitted. That doesn't make you broken, I said. It just means you learned intimacy differently. He considered that. So did you, he said. He was right. I had mistaken indispensability for love, had allowed myself to be defined by function rather than desire. We had mirrored each other's blind spots perfectly. The next day, I didn't come in at all. Not to test him, not to provoke, just because I wanted to be elsewhere. I turned off my phone, walked the city, sat in cafes without calculating time, let my thoughts wander without anchoring them to anyone else's rhythm. For the first time in months, my mind felt unoccupied by consequence. When I returned the following morning, Julian was there, working, calm. You're back, he said. I'm glad, he added after a pause, not because he needed me, but because he wanted me there. The difference was subtle, and everything. We began renegotiating proximity, not explicitly, but through practice, sitting when we chose, leaving without explanation, allowing silence to exist without obligation. The romance didn't disappear, it sharpened. There were moments when I felt the pull to return to the old ease, the old certainty, to sit beside him and let myself be absorbed into his equilibrium. It would have been comforting. But comfort without freedom is only safety for one. Julian struggled, visibly, with the uncertainty. He missed the predictability, the alignment, the way my presence once resolved his internal dissonance. And yet, he didn't ask me to return to it. That mattered more than anything. One afternoon, he moved the bench. Just a few inches. Enough to break the symmetry we had once relied on. It was too fixed, he said, almost to himself. I smiled. Distance didn't erase what we had shared. It reframed it, stripped it down to something leaner, riskier, more honest. We were no longer close because one of us couldn't function without the other. We were close because we were choosing to be. And that choice, uncertain, unstructured, unfinished, felt like the beginning of something that could finally breathe. What remained between us, after distance, was not emptiness. It was choice. That distinction took time to settle into my body. I kept expecting the old sensations to return, the subtle pressure to stay, the reflex to adjust myself around his equilibrium. But the longer we practiced separation without rupture, the more those impulses loosened their grip. Freedom, I learned, doesn't arrive as a rush. It arrives as quiet. Julian no longer oriented his workdays around my arrival. Sometimes he was there when I came in, sometimes he wasn't. When I stayed, it was because I wanted to. When I left, it was without calculation. The building breathed differently now. Less tightly, more honestly. Our conversations changed. They became less precise, more tentative. He spoke in fragments, sometimes circling thoughts instead of pinning them down immediately. I let my answers wander, allowed uncertainty into spaces where I had once offered stability. We were no longer optimized, and strangely, that made the closeness feel warmer. Romance emerged not from proximity, but from risk, from the fact that neither of us knew exactly how the other would respond anymore. The uncertainty was uncomfortable, but alive. One afternoon, Julian asked if I wanted to sit beside him. The question stunned me, not because of the invitation, but because of the asking. Yes, I said. We sat, not on the bench that had once defined us, but on two separate chairs, pulled closer together by mutual decision. Our shoulders didn't touch. The space between us felt deliberate, held. I'm learning, he said quietly, that wanting someone nearby is different from needing them to be. I nodded. It feels lighter. He considered that. Heavier, too, in a different way. He was right. Choice carries weight. Responsibility, vulnerability. I was no longer essential to his functioning. And that hurt. Briefly, in ways I hadn't expected. I had built part of my identity around being indispensable. Letting that go required grieving a version of myself I had mistaken for love. I saw it in the way he hesitated before speaking, in the way he sometimes looked at me like he was measuring distance not in inches, but in permissions. He was learning to tolerate longing without turning it into structure. That mattered. One evening, as the building emptied and the light softened, we found ourselves alone again. Not by habit, but by coincidence. The silence between us felt open, unclaimed. I'm afraid sometimes, he said suddenly. Of what? That if I don't build systems, everything will fall apart. And now? Now I'm afraid that if I build them too well, nothing can move. The honesty startled me, not because it was emotional, but because it was unfinished. He wasn't offering resolution, just truth. I stepped closer, not into him, but into the shared space between us. Movement is part of staying, I said. He didn't step back. That night, we walked out together. Not side by side in synchronized silence, but slightly out of step, allowing our paces to diverge and realign naturally. The city felt larger than it had in months. I realized then that love doesn't require enclosure to endure. It requires room. In the weeks that followed, we continued carefully, sometimes close, sometimes distant, always choosing. There were moments of longing that went unfulfilled, moments of absence that ached, but the ache was clean. I no longer felt held in place by his need, and he no longer relied on my presence to remain intact. What we shared now was fragile, but real. One morning I arrived to find a new arrangement in the workspace. Not symmetrical, not optimized, just open. Julian looked up. I left it flexible. I smiled. I like that. So do I. We stood there for a moment, neither moving, neither waiting. The story we had told ourselves, that closeness had to be constant, that love had to be stabilizing, had loosened its hold. In its place was something less certain, less efficient, and infinitely more alive. I stayed that day, not because he needed me, but because I wanted to be there. And when I left, later, I didn't feel the urge to look back, to check whether the system would hold without me. I trusted that it would. That trust, I realized, was the most intimate thing we had ever shared.